The reconnaissance ship screamed through the atmosphere of Etheria as warning alarms blared in Captain Jake. Morrison's ears and smoke filled the cockpit, making it hard to see anything beyond the cracked windshield ahead of him in the red emergency. Lights flashing all around the small control panel that was now sparking with electrical failures. Jake gripped the controls tighter as he tried to level out the descent, but the starboard engine was completely gone, and the port engine was running at only 30% power, which meant he was going down whether he liked it or not. The ship hit the ground hard, and Jake felt his body slam against the restraints as metal screeched and tore around him, before everything went dark and silent except for the ringing in his ears that seemed to go on forever until he finally opened his eyes and found himself staring at a crystalline ceiling that glowed with soft blue light. His hands were bound in chains that felt cold against his wrists, and when he tried to sit up, he realized his whole body ached like he had been trampled by horses or whatever the alien equivalent might be on this strange planet. A voice spoke from somewhere behind him, and it sounded like music mixed with wind chimes, which was both beautiful and unsettling at the same time. Jake turned his head as much as the chains would allow, and saw her standing there in the doorway of what appeared to be some kind of throne. Room with walls made entirely of crystal that reflected light in 1,000 different colors. She was tall and impossibly graceful, with silver hair that fell past her shoulders and violet eyes that seemed to look right through him, as if she could see every thought he had ever had and every secret he had ever kept. Princess Liren walked closer, and Jake noticed she wore armor that looked like it was made from polished moonlight, and carried a sword at her hip that hummed with some kind of energy he could not identify. Behind her came something that made Jake's breath catch in his throat because it was a dragon, but not like any dragon from Earth's old stories and legends. This creature was massive, with scales that gleamed like molten rubies and eyes of pure gold that fixed on Jake. With an intelligence that was almost human in its intensity, the princess studied Jake for a long moment before she spoke again, and this time he could understand her words, even though he knew she was not speaking English. Some kind of translation device must have been implanted when he was unconscious, he thought, as she told him that his ship had been shot down by automated defense systems, and that he was now a prisoner on a world that was in the middle of a war he could not possibly understand. Jake tried to speak, but his throat was dry, so she gestured, and a servant brought water in a crystal cup that looked too beautiful to drink from, but Jake was too thirsty to care about appearances. After he drank, Liren explained that her people called themselves the Aether, and they had been fighting a centuries-old war against an enemy known as the Voidborn, who consumed entire star systems to sustain their existence in this dimension. The Voidborn were refugees from a dying universe, she said, and they were desperate and dangerous, and they were winning because the Aether had lost too many warriors and too many ships over the long years of endless fighting. Jake listened and tried to process this information while also wondering how he was going to escape and get back to his own people who were probably already searching for him. Then Liren showed him something that changed everything. She led him through the crystal fortress with the dragon following behind them until they reached a massive hangar, carved into the mountain itself, and there, sitting in the center of the space, was a ship unlike anything Jake had ever seen before. It was enormous and sleek, with surfaces that seemed to shift between solid metal and liquid light, and there were symbols carved into its hull that hurt his eyes when he tried to read them. The princess called it the Star Weaver, and she explained that it was built by an ancient civilization that had disappeared thousands of years ago, leaving behind only their most powerful creations. The ship's neural interface was so complex that only beings with telepathic abilities had ever been able to pilot it. Liren told him as they walked around the vessel, and even then most pilots went insane within minutes of connecting to its systems, because the amount of information flowing through their minds was too much for any brain to handle. She had lost 12 of her best pilots trying to activate the Star Weaver, she said, and her voice carried a weight of grief that made Jake realize this war had cost her more than he could imagine. Liren turned to face Jake, and there was something in her expression that might have been amusement or might have been mockery as she told him that only geniuses could fly this ship, and that his kind, meaning humanity, barely comprehended dimensional mathematics, so he would burn out before the ship even left the hangar. But Jake noticed something in the way she said it, and in the way her shoulders slumped just slightly when she thought he was not looking. This was her last hope, he realized, and she was desperate, even if she would never admit it out loud. Jake made her an offer right there in the hangar with the dragon, watching them both with those unsettling golden eyes. He told Liren to give him one chance at the ship, and if he failed, then he would help her evacuate the remaining civilians using human technology and whatever resources his people could provide.
The princess seemed surprised by this, and she studied
his face for a long time before she finally agreed, but only because she could see that he understood what was at stake here. As the chains were removed from Jake's wrists, he rubbed the sore skin and looked up at the Starweaver towering above them both. The dragon called Ember made a low, rumbling sound that might have been a growl, or might have been something else entirely. And when Jake met those golden eyes, he felt like the creature was trying to tell him something important. But he had no idea what it could be. Liren gave orders to her attendants, and preparations began immediately because the Voidborn fleet was only 3 days away from breaking through the final defensive line. And time was something they no longer had the luxury of wasting that night. Jake was given quarters in the Crystal Fortress, and he stood at the window, looking out at the alien landscape below, thinking about his sister. Katie back on Earth, and his friend Carlos, who had died saving their colony from raiders, and all the people he had failed to protect over the years. He wondered if this was his chance to make up for those failures, or if he was just going to add one more death to the list when the Starweaver's systems fried his brain tomorrow morning. Either way, he thought he had to try, because that was what humans did when faced with impossible odds and certain death. Morning came too quickly, and Jake found himself standing at the entrance ramp of the Starweaver, with Princess Laroon beside him, and Ember, the dragon, perched on a nearby platform watching everything with those unblinking golden eyes. The princess explained the basic systems as much as she could, and warned him again that the neural interface would try to overwhelm his mind with information from 100 different sensors all at once. She told him that the ship perceived reality in 17 dimensions, and that time was not a fixed thing for the Starweaver, but rather a flexible construct that could be manipulated and bent according to the pilot's will. Jake climbed the ramp and entered the ship's interior, which was even stranger than the outside, with walls that seemed to breathe and controls that shifted position depending on where he looked. The neural interface was a throne-like chair in the center of the bridge, and there were filaments of light hanging down from the ceiling that looked like they were waiting to attach to his head. He sat down slowly and took a deep breath, trying to calm his racing heart before he reached up and touched the interface with both hands. The pain was immediate and overwhelming as something invaded his mind and tore through his memories like a hurricane ripping through a coastal town. Jake saw visions of dying stars collapsing in on themselves and heard the screams of civilizations that had been extinct for millennia, and felt the crushing weight of loneliness that came from being the last of your kind floating in the endless void of space. The ship's artificial intelligence called itself the Architect, and it was probing Jake's mind, looking for something, though he did not know what. Most pilots would try to fight this intrusion, quote, try to dominate the ship through sheer force of will. But Jake realized that approach had gotten 12 Ether pilots killed already. Instead, he did something that went against every instinct he had, which was to surrender completely and open every corner of his mind to the Architect's inspection. He showed the AI his memories of Katie and how she had been sick with the fever. That took half their colony, and how he had held her hand as she died, telling him to keep flying and keep fighting. He showed it Carlos sacrificing himself to seal the breach in their ship's hull so the rest of the crew could escape, and he showed it every moment of doubt and fear and failure he had ever experienced. The Architect seemed surprised by this response, and the pain in Jake's head shifted from sharp agony to a dull pressure as the AI began to truly examine him rather than just test his limits. Then came the real challenge, as data streams from hundreds of sensors flooded into Jake's consciousness all at once, showing him the ship's fuel levels and structural integrity and weapon systems and navigation data and 1,000 other things that his human brain was never designed to process simultaneously. Most minds would shatter under this load, but Jake's mind did something unexpected as it began to fragment into pieces and then immediately started rebuilding itself in a new configuration that could handle the information flow. He began to see, in 17 dimensions, which was impossible to describe to anyone who had only experienced 3, but it was like suddenly understanding that every object existed in multiple states at the same time, and that the past and future were just different directions you could look if you knew how to turn your head properly. Time became flexible, and Jake could see probability streams branching out from every decision point, showing him potential futures that might or might not come to pass, depending on the choices he made. Outside the ship, Princess Liren watched in shock as the Starweaver's lights began to pulse with energy for the first time in 50 years. The crystal walls of the hangar reflected the glow in 1,000 different colors, and Ember suddenly roared so loudly that the entire fortress shook, and guards came running thinking they were under attack. The dragon's golden eyes were fixed on the ship, and there was something in the creature's posture that looked almost like celebration, as if Ember had been waiting for this moment for a very long time. 3 hours passed before Jake finally disconnected from the neural interface and stumbled down the ramp on shaking legs. His eyes now had a faint silver glow that had not been there before, and he moved with a strange grace as if he was not quite sure where his body ended and the rest of the universe began. Liren caught him before he fell, and she stared into his glowing eyes with an expression that mixed awe and fear in equal measure. Because what she was seeing should not be possible for a human or for any being that lacked telepathic abilities. Jake told her between gasps for air that he had done it, and that he was bonded with the Starweaver now, and that the ship had accepted him as its pilot. More than that, he said he had accessed weapon systems and defensive protocols that even the ancient builders had kept hidden in the deepest layers of the ship's programming. The architect had shown him things that were meant to be secret, and had given him control over technologies that could reshape reality itself if used properly. The princess helped Jake to the medical bay, where doctors examined him and declared that his vital signs were stable, even though his brain activity was off the charts compared to normal human readings. Liren sat beside his bed as he recovered, and for the first time since they met her, teasing confident mask slipped away, and he saw genuine concern in her violet eyes. She asked him how it felt to be connected to something so vast and ancient, and Jake tried to explain, but found that human language did not have words for some of the concepts he now understood. Ember came to visit as well, and the dragon lowered her massive head to look directly into Jake's silver glowing eyes, as if searching for something. Then the creature made a rumbling sound that might have been approval, and gently touched her snout to Jake's forehead in what felt like a blessing or perhaps a warning. Liren explained that Ember had never done that before with anyone except members of the royal bloodline, and she did not know what it meant. But she suspected the dragon saw something in Jake that went beyond his successful bonding with the Starweaver. Over the next 2 days, Jake practiced flying the ship in simulation mode and learned to control systems that had been dormant for thousands of years. The Starweaver responded to his thoughts now, and he could feel the ship's presence in the back of his mind, like a constant companion offering suggestions and corrections when he made mistakes. Liren taught him about Aetherian tactics and showed him recordings of previous battles against the Voidborn so he could understand what they were up against, but time was running out faster than anyone wanted to admit, and reports came in that the Voidborn fleet had been detected entering the outer system 2 days ahead of schedule. 300 ships strong, they said, and all of them pulsing with stolen energy from dead stars that they had consumed on their way here. The final battle was coming whether they were ready or not, and Jake knew that everything depended on him being able to use the Starweaver effectively in actual combat conditions rather than just in simulations. The night before the battle, Jake stood in the hangar, looking up at the ship and wondering if he was really ready for what was coming, or if he was just fooling himself into thinking he could make a difference. Liren found him there and stood beside him in silence for a while before she finally spoke and told him that she had spent 3,000 years watching her people die in this endless war, and that she had long ago given up hope of ever seeing it end. But now, she said, looking at him with those violet eyes, there was something different in the air, and maybe, just maybe, they had a chance to change everything. The days that followed the successful bonding were filled with intensive training as Jake learned to truly master the Starweaver's capabilities, while Princess Liran reluctantly became his guide through the complex history and technology of her people. They spent long hours in the ship's bridge running combat simulations and discussing tactics, and Jake began to notice things about the princess that she tried very hard to hide from everyone around her. The way her hands trembled slightly when she thought no one was looking, and the shadows under her eyes that spoke of two many sleepless nights, and the careful mask she wore that made her seem confident and in control, when inside she was barely holding herself together. During one of their training sessions, Liran finally told him the truth about who she really was and what burden she carried. She explained that she was not just a princess by title, but rather the last surviving member of the royal bloodline, who possessed the ability to command the ancient defense network that protected this entire sector of space. The network had been built by the same civilization that created the Starweaver, and it required a specific genetic marker to activate its full capabilities. If she died, then billions of people across dozens of worlds would lose their only protection against the Voidborn invasion. Jake listened as she described the 3,000-year war and how she had watched generation after generation of her people fight and die against an enemy that never stopped coming. She told him about her parents who had sacrificed themselves in a desperate gambit to destroy a Voidborn mothership, and about her brother who had gone mad from the stress of command and had to be removed from power. She spoke of friends and lovers and mentors who were all gone now, leaving her alone with the weight of an entire civilization's survival resting on her shoulders. The Voidborn were not simply mindless destroyers, Liran explained as they stood together looking at tactical displays showing enemy movements. They were actually refugees from a dimension where entropy had won, and where the natural state of existence was cold darkness and slow death. They had found a way to cross into this dimension thousands of years ago, and they consumed matter and energy not out of malice, but out of desperate need to sustain their existence in a reality that was fundamentally hostile to their nature. It did not make them less dangerous, she said, but it did make them tragic in a way that made the war even more heartbreaking. Jake shared his own revelations during these conversations and told Liran things he had not spoken about to anyone else. He admitted that his mission to Etheria had not been a simple reconnaissance flight, but rather a covert operation ordered by Earth's High Command to locate and acquire advanced alien technology. Humanity had been lying about their intentions, he said, and they had sent him to steal whatever he could find and bring it back so Earth could reverse engineer it and gain an advantage in their own territorial disputes. The guilt of this deception had been eating at him since he crashed, and now that he had found something worth protecting rather than stealing, he did not know how to face his own people when they eventually came looking for him. Princess Liran was surprisingly understanding about this admission, and she told him that every civilization went through a phase where they prioritized their own survival over ethical considerations. The Ether had done terrible things in the early days of their war with the Voidborn, she said, and it had taken centuries for them to learn that some lines should never be crossed no matter how desperate the situation became. She did not judge Jake for his original mission, but she did ask him what he planned to do now that he understood what was really at stake here. Their growing trust was interrupted by urgent news that made both of them forget about philosophical discussions. Voidborn scout ships had been detected probing outer defenses with unusual coordination and intelligence, suggesting that someone was feeding them information about weak points in the defensive network. There was a traitor somewhere in Liran's court, and they needed to identify this person before the main fleet arrived, or else the entire defensive strategy would collapse before the battle even began. Ember the dragon became more agitated as the days passed, and the creature would pace around the fortress, making low rumbling sounds that set everyone on edge. Liran explained that Ember was far more than just a pet or a weapon, but rather a living construct created by the ancient civilization to serve as a guardian and guide for the last heir of the Covenant. The dragon could see probability streams and potential futures, which made Ember invaluable for strategic planning, but also meant the creature knew things that no one else could know, and sometimes those things were deeply disturbing. Through Ember's golden eyes, Liren could catch glimpses of fate itself, and that was how she had known that Jake would be important when he first arrived. Every future the dragon had shown her featured humanity playing a crucial role in the outcome of the war, but the exact nature of that role remained frustratingly unclear. Some futures showed humans and Ether standing together against a common enemy, while other futures showed betrayal and destruction and the collapse of everything both civilizations had built. The fact that the future was not fixed meant that choices still mattered, and that was both encouraging and terrifying. Jake and Liren worked together to investigate the suspected traitor. Using a combination of human investigative techniques and Ether telepathic scanning, they narrowed down the suspects to a handful of high-ranking officials who had access to critical defense information and who had exhibited suspicious behavior in recent weeks. But every time they got close to identifying the culprit, something would happen to divert their attention or destroy evidence, and it became clear that whoever the traitor was, they were very good at covering their tracks. Time ran out faster than anyone wanted as long-range sensors detected the main Voidborn fleet entering the system ahead of schedule. 300 ships arranged in formations that defied conventional military doctrine and all of them moving with perfect coordination that came from sharing a hive consciousness. The enemy would be in weapons range within 18 hours, and there was no more time for investigations or preparations. They would have to fight with what they had and hope it was enough to survive. Princess Liren called a council of war and gathered her remaining military commanders in the Crystal Throne Room to discuss final battle plans. Jake attended as the pilot of the Starweaver, and he watched as proud Ether warriors who fought for centuries argued about tactics and strategies with voices that carried the weight of too many losses. Some wanted to fall back and preserve what forces they had left, while others advocated for an all-out assault to take down as many Voidborn ships as possible before the defenses fell. No one seemed to believe they could actually win this battle, and that hopelessness hung in the air like a physical presence. Jake studied the tactical displays and saw something that everyone else had missed because they were too focused on conventional warfare. The Voidborn were not just attacking randomly, but rather they were moving in patterns that suggested they were searching for something specific on the planet's surface. He pointed this out to Liren, and together they cross-referenced enemy movements with maps of ancient ruins, and suddenly everything clicked into place. The traitor had not just given the Voidborn information about defenses, but it also told them about the ancient network's true capabilities. The defense network did not just protect against attacks, Liren explained with growing horror in her voice. It could also permanently merge dimensions, if activated with the correct sequence, which would give the Voidborn unlimited access to energy from multiple realities and doom both civilizations in the process. The traitor wanted the Voidborn to win, she realized, and they were willing to sacrifice everything to make that happen because they believed it was the only way to end the war. Before they could process this revelation, Ember suddenly roared and burst through the crystal windows of the throne room, taking flight toward the hangar where the Starweaver waited. Jake and Liren ran after the dragon and reached the hangar just in time to see something impossible happening. Ember was merging with the Starweaver's hull in a blinding flash of light that forced everyone to shield their eyes, and when the light faded, the ship had changed into something entirely new that was part organic and part mechanical and part something else that had no name in any language. Jake felt Ember's consciousness join with his own, and with the architect's presence that was already in his mind, creating a trinity of awareness that transcended anything he had experienced before. Through the dragon's precognitive abilities, he could now see the branching probability streams of the future. And he understood with terrible clarity what they had to do to win this war. The solution was impossible and suicidal and absolutely necessary, and when he shared the vision with Liren, through their mental connection she whispered that no human should be capable of this level of courage or this level of madness. The dawn came painted in shades of crimson and gold as if the sky itself knew that blood would be spilled before the day ended, and Jake Morrison stood in the merged vessel that had once been the Starweaver and was now something far greater. The ship responded to his thoughts with perfect precision, and he could feel Ember's consciousness intertwined with his own, providing access to precognitive, visions that showed him the paths through probability, where victory might be possible. Princess Liren stood beside him on the bridge, and her violet eyes reflected the strange light emanating from the organic metal walls that pulsed with life. The Voidborn armada appeared on the sensors like a spreading shadow that consumed the stars as 300 ships materialized from dimensional rifts and began their approach with terrifying coordination. Each enemy vessel pulsed with energy stolen from dead civilizations, and their hulls were made from compressed matter that defied conventional physics. They moved as one entity because they shared a hive consciousness that made them far more dangerous than any individual ship could be, and their weapons could tear through normal armor like paper. Jake launched the merged vessel and felt the power coursing through every system as he took manual control and pushed the ship into impossible maneuvers that would have torn apart any conventional craft. He attacked from multiple vectors simultaneously, using the dimensional drives to appear in one location and then another before the enemy could track his movements. Behind him, Liren coordinated the remains of her fleet, providing tactical data and managing defensive formations while also monitoring the traitors' movements through the network. The space battle was beautiful in a terrible way as energy beams cut through the void and ships exploded in silent fireballs that briefly illuminated the darkness before fading away forever. Jake introduced tactics that the Ether had never considered before using: kamikaze drones, made from old satellites, and electromagnetics, pulse weapons that disrupted the hive minds, coordination, and psychological warfare through erratic attack patterns that confused the enemy's strategic algorithms. For every 10 Voidborn ships he destroyed, 20 more appeared to take their place, but he kept fighting because there was nothing else he could do. Princess Liren analyzed the battle data and realized with growing horror that they were losing. Despite Jake's extraordinary piloting skills, the defensive satellites were falling one by one, and the enemy was pushing closer to the planet's surface, where the ancient ruins held the key to the dimensional merger that would doom everyone. She made a decision that surprised even herself and told Jake through their mental link that she would take Ember's physical form and fly directly into the heart of the enemy fleet to manually activate the defense network's core weapon. It was a suicide mission because the activation would trigger an explosion that sealed dimensional rifts, but it would also trap her in the blast radius with no possibility of escape. Jake refused to accept this plan because he had seen something in the probability streams that Liren had missed due to her focus on conventional tactics. The Voidborn were not just attacking the planet, but were actively searching for something in the ancient ruins, and their search pattern revealed the traitor's ultimate goal. Whoever had betrayed the Ether had not just given information to the enemy, but had actually told them how to access the network's dimensional merger capabilities, which would transform the Voidborn from desperate refugees into unstoppable conquerors with unlimited energy from infinite realities. Liren processed this information and felt a rage building inside her that she had not experienced in centuries of warfare. The traitor had not just betrayed her people, but had condemned billions of innocent beings across multiple dimensions to slavery or death under the Voidborn hive mind. She accessed the security systems and began cross-referencing everyone who had knowledge of the network's true capabilities with those who had opportunity to communicate with the enemy, and the results narrowed down to one name that made her heart sink. General Kale had been her most trusted military advisor for over a century, and he had stood by her side through the darkest moments of the war. He had lost his entire family when the Voidborn destroyed his home world, and everyone had assumed his dedication to the war effort came from a desire for revenge. But Liren now understood that Kale's losses had broken something fundamental inside him, and he had been shown carefully curated visions by the Voidborn hive mind that convinced him the only path to peace was through surrender and merger with the enemy consciousness. As if summoned by her thoughts, General Kale's ship appeared on the sensors, moving toward the ancient ruins with escort vessels that should have been defending the planet's surface. Jake immediately changed course and pushed the merged vessel to intercept, while Liren attempted to establish communications with her former advisor, hoping she could somehow talk him down from this path of destruction. When Kale's face appeared on the view screen, he looked older. Then she remembered, and there was a strange peace in his expression that made him seem almost serene. Despite the chaos of the battle raging around them, Kale explained that the Voidborn had shown him a future where both species could survive through symbiosis and mutual understanding. He spoke of a merger where individual consciousness would be preserved, while gaining access to the collective knowledge and strength of the hive mind. It would mean the end of war, he said, and the beginning of a new era where all beings could exist without fear or suffering. His words carried conviction, but Jake saw through the deception immediately because he could perceive the probability streams that Kale could not see. The visions the general had been shown were carefully edited to hide the true nature of what merger with the Voidborn consciousness actually meant. Individual minds would not be preserved, but rather consumed and broken down into component parts that served the hive's collective will. There would be no war because there would be no individuals left to disagree or fight back, and the peace Kale imagined was actually the peace of extinction. Jake tried to explain this through the communication channel, but the general had been too thoroughly manipulated to hear reason anymore. Confrontation came to a head when Kale's ship reached the ancient ruins and began the activation sequence for the dimensional merger protocol. Jake knew he had only seconds to act, and he made a decision that went against every tactical doctrine but felt right in a way he could not explain. He opened a direct communication channel using the merged vessel's capabilities and spoke to General Kale not as an enemy, but as someone who understood the crushing weight of survivors' guilt and the desperate need to make suffering mean something. Jake told Kale about Katie and Carlos and all the people he had failed to save over the years, and how he had wanted to believe there was some grand purpose to all that loss. He spoke about the temptation to accept easy answers when reality was too painful to bear, and he shared his understanding that sometimes the hardest choice was to keep fighting even when you could not see a clear path to victory. His words were simple and unpolished compared to the philosophical arguments the ether might have used, but they carried a raw honesty that cut through the hive minds. Manipulation. For a moment, General Kale hesitated, and in that moment of doubt, Jake saw the probability streams shift and branch into new configurations that had not existed before. The general looked at Lorraine's face on his screen, and something in his eyes changed, as if he was truly seeing her for the first time in years. He realized what he had almost done, and the magnitude of his betrayal crashed down on him with crushing force. There was no way to undo what he had started, but there was still a chance to minimize the damage if he was willing to pay the ultimate price. General Kale sent one final message to Princess Liren, asking for her forgiveness, even though he knew he did not deserve it. Then he turned his ship around and flew directly toward the dimensional rift's stabilizers that the Voidborn had deployed. His vessel was not large enough to destroy them completely, but it would by Jake precious seconds by disrupting the energy flow and destabilizing the rift's containment field. Kale's ship impacted the stabilizers at full speed and exploded in a brilliant flash that sent shockwaves through the dimensional fabric itself. Jake did not waste the sacrifice as he pushed the merged vessel toward the dimensional tear that was now partially unstable and beginning to collapse on itself. Liren understood what he was planning, and she wanted to stop him, but she also knew there was no other way to seal the rift permanently and prevent the Voidborn from ever accessing unlimited energy from multiple dimensions. Through their mental link, she felt his determination and his acceptance of what was about to happen, and she realized that sometimes courage meant letting go of the people you cared about so they could do what needed to be done. Jake Morrison piloted the merged vessel into the heart of the dimensional rift and reality itself began to break down around him as the laws of physics became suggestions rather than rules. He experienced existence from perspectives that should have been impossible as his consciousness expanded to encompass viewpoints from across multiple timelines and parallel dimensions. Through the connection with Ember's precognitive abilities, he could see the Voidborn's true nature not as evil conquerors, but as desperate, drowning creatures clinging to the only lifeline they could find in an existence that was fundamentally hostile to their survival. The Voidborn came from a dimension where entropy had won its eternal battle against order and where the universe had reached its final state of heat. Death billions of years before life should have been possible. They had evolved in the darkness between dead stars, learning to subsist on quantum fluctuations and random probability events that occasionally created temporary pockets of usable energy. When they discovered the dimensional rifts that connected to younger universes, where stars still burned and energy still flowed, they had seen salvation rather than conquest. Jake felt their hunger and their fear and their desperate hope that maybe this time they could find a way to exist without destroying everything they touched. He understood that from their perspective, they were not invaders but rather refugees seeking asylum, and that the consumption of matter and energy was not a choice but a biological necessity as fundamental as breathing was for humans. The tragedy was that their survival requirements were incompatible with the survival of any other form of life, and there was no diplomatic solution that could reconcile that fundamental conflict. But understanding did not mean acceptance, and compassion did not mean surrender. Jake had to make a choice that would affect billions of beings across multiple dimensions, and he chose to protect the living civilizations of this universe, even if it meant condemning the Voidborn to slow extinction in their dying dimension. It was not a choice anyone should have to make, but it was the choice that had fallen to him, and he would bear the weight of it for however long he had left to live. Using the Trinity consciousness formed by his human intuition and the architect's calculations and Ember's precognitive abilities, Jake performed something that should have been impossible according to every known law of physics and metaphysics. He did not simply close the dimensional rift, but rather created a stable microdimension that existed between realities where the Voidborn could survive without consuming resources from other universes. It was a bubble reality with its own rules and its own quantum mechanics calibrated specifically to support their form of existence. The creation process required him to hold multiple dimensions in alignment simultaneously, while also channeling massive amounts of energy through the merged vessel systems and through his own consciousness, which had become the linchpin holding everything together. The Starweaver's hull began to disintegrate as the strain exceeded even its incredible tolerances, and Ember's physical form started dispersing into pure energy that scattered across dimensional boundaries. Jake felt his own mind beginning to fragment under the impossible load as neurons fired beyond their capacity and synaptic connections burned out one by one. Princess Liren felt Ember's consciousness fading through their ancient bond, and she made a decision that went against every law and tradition of her people. She channeled the full power of the defense network through her own body, using the royal bloodline's genetic connection to focus energy that should have required an entire planet's resources. She poured everything she had into stabilizing Jake's mind and reconstituting Ember's essence and binding them both back to physical reality through sheer force of will and the accumulated power of 3,000 years of her ancestors. The effort burned through Liren's telepathic abilities like fire through paper, and she felt her connection to the ancient network severing one strand at a time until finally she was just a woman standing on a bridge, watching as reality reasserted itself around them. The defense network went dormant without her royal abilities to guide it, and she became fully mortal for the first time in her impossibly long life. She could no longer see the future or read minds or command ancient technologies, but she found she did not care about those losses because Jake was alive and Ember was whole and the war was finally over. Jake awakened 3 weeks later in a medical bay with sunlight streaming through crystal windows and the sound of reconstruction work echoing from somewhere outside. His body had recovered from the physical trauma, but he knew. He was forever changed by the experience of holding multiple dimensions in his consciousness. His eyes retained their silver glow, and he could still perceive reality in ways that no unmodified human should be able to. And he suspected those changes would be permanent reminders of what he had done. Ember was curled up on the floor beside his bed, and the dragon was smaller now, about the size of a large horse rather than a building, but still, it's magnificent, with ruby scales that gleamed in the sunlight. The dragon's golden eyes opened when Jake stirred, and there was something in that gaze that felt like welcome and approval and perhaps even affection. Ember made a rumbling sound that might have been a purr and rested, her head on the edge of the bed as if to say that everything was going to be all right. Princess Liren sat in a chair on the other side of the bed, and she looked different without the weight of ancient power surrounding her. Her violet eyes were simply beautiful now, rather than unnaturally piercing, and she wore a genuine smile that had no trace of the teasing mask she used to hide behind. She told Jake about the aftermath of the battle, and how the Voidborn fleet had withdrawn when their access to the dimensional rift was cut off. Some ships had chosen to enter the micro-dimension he created, while others had retreated back to their dying home dimension to face whatever fate awaited them there. The political situation was complicated, because General Kale's betrayal had exposed weaknesses in the Aether. Command structure and there were difficult conversations happening about how to prevent such manipulation in the future. But there was also hope for the first time in centuries, because the immediate threat had been neutralized, and both civilizations had a chance to rebuild without the constant pressure of imminent extinction. The scattered Voidborn forces that remained in the main dimension were being offered asylum and integration. Assistance, rather than extermination, which was a controversial policy, but one that Liren believed was necessary. Earth's response to Jake's actions was still unknown, because communication across interstellar distances took time, even with advanced technology. His sister Katie had survived the illness that he thought had killed her, and she had commandeered a rescue fleet to come looking for him, which would arrive within the next few weeks. Liren seemed nervous about meeting humanity's representatives, and Jake understood her concern because his people had a complicated history of first contact situations that did not always end peacefully. Over the following days, Jake recovered his strength and began helping with reconstruction efforts, while also preparing for the inevitable meeting between Earth and Etheria. He worked alongside Liren and her people, and found that the barriers between their civilizations were not as insurmountable as they had seemed when he first arrived. Humans and Ether had different evolutionary paths and different cultural values, but they shared fundamental desires for survival and meaning and connection that transcended species boundaries. Ember became Jake's constant companion, and the dragons seemed to take delight in terrorizing the reconstruction workers by swooping down unexpectedly or stealing tools from their hands. But there was playfulness in the creature's mischief that had not been present before when Ember carried the weight of being a living weapon designed to protect the last royal heir. Now the dragon could simply be a dragon and enjoy existence without the burden of cosmic responsibility. When Earth's fleet finally arrived, it was led by Katie Morrison, who turned out to be very much alive and very angry at her brother for disappearing without explanation. The reunion was emotional and complicated as Jake tried to explain everything that had happened, and Katie tried to process the fact that her brother now had glowing silver eyes and could perceive 17 dimensions and had bonded with an ancient alien, warship, and a dragon. Eventually, she accepted that he was still Jake underneath all the changes, and she hugged him tightly while telling him never to scare her like that again. The first official contact between Earth and Etheria took place in the acute crystal throne room with Princess Liren, representing her people, and Katie Morrison representing humanity, because she was the fleet commander, and also because she refused to let anyone else speak for Earth after coming all this way. The negotiations were tense at first because there was a lot of history and mistrust to overcome, but gradually both sides found common ground based on their shared experience of nearly losing everything to an incomprehensible threat. Jake and Liren stood together on the fortress balcony, watching the diplomatic proceedings unfold below them and reflecting on how far they had come from that first meeting when he was chained and she was desperate. They had proven that cooperation between different species was not only possible,